I want to start by, it's called Broca's Systems Hijack. I want to start by talking about Pictionary. Someone else is drawing the shapes and you're on the guessing team. Debbie draws the shape on the board, you make a guess, rice. But you're wrong. As Ian shouts something you don't understand, you realise we're not playing in English anymore. You want to guess, but you don't want to let your teammates down. Debbie gives you a dirty look for being silent, so you have another go. Back in ordinary life, as language enters the brain, various parts of it become activated, like lightning crossing a thundercloud. We can see these regions on fMRI scans. We can see when language on the page enters the brain, it does some simultaneous processing, which is quite subtle and kind of incredible. In line with your left eardrum is the left inferotemporal cortex. This contains direct lexical access, which is the home of words with which we are most familiar. But, and, the swim around in a kind of strange fairy dust of conjunctives. What the left inferotemporal cortex doesn't know, our neurons will look for elsewhere, searching the woods. When we don't know a word, we sound it out in our mind, and it's what's called phonological assembly. What most of you are doing right now when looking at this word is broadening the search in the brain, both hemispheres working in the temporal lobes just above the inferotemporal cortex, in line with the tops of your ears, and then trying to sound out the word in the darkness, in a kind of soggy broccoli world of the brain. At the same time, the more logic-centered part of the brain, the right-hand side and the left-hand side, the more creative side, both are working in tandem on the problem. We call this process cross-modal activation, a synergy of creative and logical thinking. At the same time, the inferior parietal cortex, just behind the ears, deeper within the brain, is also running a search. Together, this forms a kind of radar arm of activity. As this sounding out is occurring, we're also referencing the semantic relationships of where the word is in space, its associative relationship, either in a sentence or its similar properties to known words. This activation also occurs in the inferior frontal gyrus, just behind our eyes. We search for visual relationships, sonic relationships, etymological relationships, and so on. The inferior frontal gyrus is within the Broca's area of the brain, the part responsible for comprehension and utterance. Do you know what this word means? Back to Pictionary. The sound in the plastic timer keeps on draining away. Things in the game are getting more strange. Debbie moves the board to the side to reveal what looks like your clone. They're older than you are, showing a bit of grey hair. He pushes the barrel so it's flush against your clone's temple. She has a pistol in her hand. You put the two together. You realise, as he says in English, guess or your future gets it. You want to guess, but you just don't know. It's not that you're stupid, but it might seem so. You plead with them, you don't understand, but they won't take it for an excuse. And the game continues, which you realise is some kind of long and horrible protracted torture. Back to our word. Propoeduetic adjective, serving as a preliminary instruction to further study. In the dyslexic brain, underactivation in this relay race results in problems with the shape of the language on the page, or correctly associating the right sounds with the right letter. This is something which is from my biology teacher from 1989. Back to Pictionary. You look at the opposing team. You look at the opposing team as they break out into laughter. Is this some kind of sick joke? Apparently Molly and Tessa don't think so. Tessa says, "What's the matter? You stupid, you idiot. Why don't you guess?" Well, Molly jumps in and says, "What's the matter with you? You're not even trying." We are now activating the occipital temporal cortex, which is at the back of the brain, close to the top of the neck, but above the cerebellum. Here is where parallel letter processing occurs. We read the phrase, and the result appears fluent in the mind, rather than discordant or jumpy. Activation of this area occurs during word assembly and quickly provides us with a solution. A common test to measure the effectiveness of this part of the relay within our brains is the RAM, or Rapid Automatized Naming Test. The test asks us to identify letters against the clock. Starting at the top row, anybody wants to join in, we're going to say these words. We have 10 seconds to read these out loud. The effectiveness of the REN test is an early identifier of dyslexia. It's still yet to be completely proved, but so far the results look strong. But people with dyslexia really struggle with this, and people without less so. Just as a blind person might become adept at echolocation, or a deaf person's touch abilities become suddenly improved or hypersensitive, so too a dyslexic's brain will also compensate for the lack of lexical comprehension. This is down to something called cross-modal plasticity within the brain, where it remodels its own internal wiring, creating bizarre and strange connections and hijacking other areas which are ordinarily underactivated. The game of Pictionary is a pretty good analogue for dyslexia. This is something I wrote about on the 14th of November in 1989, where I took a kind of ever-ready torch from the kitchen drawer and then proceeded to shine it directly into my mother's eyes, and then got into a lot of trouble doing it, but at the same time observed something about her pupils and my own as I then went into my room, took the torch out and shone it directly into my own face, and then just watched this kind of series of bulbs vanish off into a sort of Hollywood strange staircase of light bulbs and reality. So the game of Pictionary is a pretty good analogue for the dyslexia experience. Using abstract shapes against the clock to depict recognisable objects, places, people or common situations without the reference point of verbal or physical cues is difficult and it's horrible, and all of those elements of shame and worrying about our future and feeling lost and humiliated, as well as being accused of being slow, stupid or lazy, continue. And they are the daily experiences of people with dyslexia a lot of the time, and certainly mine. It's understandable then why a lot of us retreat into ourselves. We might get angry or frustrated for no discernible reason. It's all down to a long, unending, are we even friends anymore, traumatic game of Pictionary in which you have started to burn your own clothes out of frustration and semi-madness. In order to not feel as though we're going completely insane, it's important to build an interface with the outside world, which can be learning strategies, coping strategies, but also concrete tools. I'm just going to show you quickly this with something I've built, which I call the rack. So weirdly, sort of one of the areas that I seem to be really good at is Excel, and I don't know why really, but in order to construct language, I find it in this kind of anechoic space really, really good and really safe, because it's a sort of strange digital sanctuary free of judgment. There's nobody around to say that what I'm saying or doing is incorrect on the page. And so it's rather refreshing. So I have a very strange kind of intimate relationship with computers, with that strange input-output relationship. There's something that Joan Gracie once said, who was a kind of pioneering phone hacker in the 1970s. He said, is there anything more soothing in the world than the sound of a dial tone? And I have to say, I kind of agree with him. It's that pre-linguistic electronic space. So as we look across this strange sheet, it's got various equations that I've put into it. It seems kind of weird and out of kilter with reality. As soon as you put a piece into it, which I created by taking the entire book of Peter Pan and splicing the text together into Excel and then splitting it out and removing all the intermediary words that we normally have direct lexical access to. So in other words, I moved everything that was a kind of conjunctive or a kind of additional word, and so on. And then I took out anything that was a repeated word, and then I stripped it together and then turned it into this, which is a kind of sonnet. And you can see that automatically it calculates the syllable count, a good measure, which is a sort of part of my kind of Asperger's element of my brain, which is hunting around constantly looking for patterns all the time, trying to see the pattern. And as soon as it goes green, then we're normally good to go, but I'm still drafting it. And at the same time, we've got a kind of estimated meter, which I've invented here, which kind of tells me roughly what the meter's doing. And then I can see what the consistency value of that meter is. So I can tell roughly what the percentage likelihood that it's actually accurate and working, or whether or not it's completely faulty. And then I have a kind of number of lines values, so that kind of instant moment where I can't estimate the exact size or length of the poem by just sort of in a kind of flash. This does that for me, and then it tells me what the approximate form is, so I can change here the value, and then it will look at different forms according to what it should be, what it kind of spits out at the end. This was based on a previous machine that I built, a little piece of Excel that I built for my students, which was what I call the Sistina Bakery, which was a place that automated Sistinas, so they can build Sistinas automatically from bits of code. Thanks very much.